For most of this summer, the Atlantic Ocean has been doing something it almost never does during the heart of hurricane season, sitting quiet. Not calm in the sense of a gentle, ordinary lull between storms, but genuinely, statistically quiet in a way meteorologists have only recorded a handful of times in the last 60 years. Sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic have been running cooler than they have in 4 years. Wind shear, the atmospheric force that tears apart a storm structure before it can organize, has been running higher to start August than forecasters have ever measured at this point in the season. And sinking air, the kind that suffocates a developing system before it ever gets the chance to build real convection, has been sitting stubbornly in place over the exact stretch of ocean that normally produces the season's biggest, longest-lived hurricanes. That combination has kept the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season eerily silent through the opening days of what is supposed to be its most dangerous stretch. But as of today, that silence is facing its first real test. The National Hurricane Center has just designated a new area of disturbed weather in the central Atlantic as Invest 92L, giving it a 70% chance of organizing into a tropical depression within the next couple of days, right around the exact calendar date when the season's first hurricane typically forms. A second system is also being watched several hundred miles northeast of Bermuda. Neither one currently threatens the United States directly. But after summer, this unusually still, the sudden emergence of not one but two systems worth tracking is exactly the kind of moment meteorologists watch most closely, because in a season this quiet, the storm that finally breaks the silence tends to matter more than it would in almost any other year. Today, we're going to walk through exactly why this Atlantic season has been so unusually suppressed. What's different about the system now forming, why forecasters are treating even a modest storm with unusual seriousness this year, and what history tells us about the real danger hiding inside a hurricane season that looks quiet on paper. Before we get further into it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, especially if you're anywhere near the Gulf Coast, the Southeast, the Caribbean, or Bermuda, because even a storm with a highly uncertain track deserves your attention this early in its development. If you want to stay ahead of how this system evolves over the coming days, go ahead and subscribe now, because these forecasts can shift meaningfully within just 24 hours, and a thumbs up genuinely helps this reach more people who need to start paying attention. Now let's break down exactly what's been happening in the Atlantic this year, and why this particular storm matters so much. To understand why a single developing system is generating this much attention, you first have to understand just how abnormal this Atlantic hurricane season has been up to this point. The season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. And while activity technically starts slow every year, ramping up through the so-called Cape Verde season in August and September, when storms begin forming off the west coast of Africa and tracking across the entire ocean basin, this year's ramp-up simply never happened on schedule. Forecasters at NOAA had already been signaling early warning signs of a below-average season, but as the summer progressed, those signals only grew stronger. NOAA's own seasonal outlook, updated as the season progressed, raised its estimated probability of a below-normal season from 55% all the way up to 75%, an unusually large upward revision mid-season. At the same time, the agency cut its projected range for major hurricanes, storms reaching Category 3 strength or higher, down to somewhere between 0 and 2 for the entire season, a dramatic reduction from typical projections. If that low-end scenario holds and the Atlantic produces 0 major hurricanes this year, it would mark the first time that's happened since 2013, a season now remembered specifically for how unusual its complete absence of major hurricanes actually was. The driving force behind this suppressed season is a textbook case of one of the most powerful climate patterns affecting the entire planet, a developing El Niño. El Niño describes a periodic warming of sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. And while that warming happens thousands of miles away from the Atlantic basin, its downstream effects on Atlantic hurricane activity are well documented and remarkably consistent. When El Niño strengthens, it tends to intensify the upper-level winds racing across the Atlantic from west to east, dramatically increasing wind shear across the exact region where tropical storms need calm, undisturbed atmospheric layers to organize and strengthen. Meteorologists have been blunt about just how strong that effect has been this year, describing wind shear across the Atlantic to start August as being about as elevated as they've ever measured it at this point in the season. Layer on top of that shear a stretch of sinking, stable air parked directly over the Atlantic's main development region, the swath of ocean between the west coast of Africa and the Caribbean that historically produces the largest, most dangerous, longest-tracking hurricanes of any part of the basin, and you get a combination one meteorologist described bluntly as a knockout 1-2 punch against tropical development, conditions that have shown no meaningful sign of retreating as August has unfolded. The result has been a level of quiet that genuinely stands out even against the historical record. Going back 60 years, there have only been 2 Augusts that finished without a single tropical depression, named storm or hurricane forming anywhere in the Atlantic Basin, one in 1997 and another more recently in 2022. Both of those quiet Augusts are remembered for very different reasons depending on what followed them. The 1997 season stayed quiet, essentially through its entire remaining months, finishing as one of the least active Atlantic hurricane seasons of the last 3 decades. The 2022 season, by contrast, offers a considerably more cautionary lesson, because despite an eerily quiet August with 0 tropical development, the season exploded back to life in September, ultimately producing Hurricane Ian, a storm that went on to devastate southwest Florida and rank among the costliest hurricanes in American history. That contrast, one quiet August fading into an overall quiet season, another quiet August erupting into catastrophe just weeks later, is exactly why meteorologists refuse to treat a slow start as any kind of guarantee about how the rest of a season will unfold. And it's precisely the historical backdrop against which this week's developments in the Atlantic are being watched so closely. That brings us to Invest 92L itself, the system currently at the center of attention. As of this week, the disturbance sat more than 500 miles southwest of the Cape Verde Islands, still consisting of disorganized showers and thunderstorms without a clearly defined center of circulation, the kind of loosely packed tropical wave that emerges from the African coastline on a fairly routine basis throughout the summer months. What separates this particular wave from the dozens of others that have fizzled out earlier this season is the forecast for the atmosphere immediately surrounding it. Conditions are expected to become meaningfully more favorable for organization over the next several days, and the National Hurricane Center has assigned the system a 70% chance of developing into at least a tropical depression within the coming days, a notably high probability for a system that, just days earlier, barely registered on forecaster radar. Once a wave like this earns an official Invest designation, meteorologists gain access to specialized computer modeling specifically built to project its potential track and intensity. And the first full round of models for this system became available almost immediately after the designation, giving forecasters their earliest real look at where this storm might be headed. If the system does organize into a fully named tropical storm, the next name on this year's Atlantic storm list is Cristobal. And given the current trajectory of the wave, meteorologists widely expect that designation to be used within the coming days. Roughly simultaneously, a second area of interest has emerged several hundred miles northeast of Bermuda, an area of low pressure embedded within a broader trough that the National Hurricane Center has designated Invest 93L. This system carries a considerably lower probability of development, currently assessed at around 20%, and it faces a very different set of obstacles than the system forming near Cape Verde. Rather than tracking across the warm tropical waters of the main development region, this trough sits closer to the boundary between tropical and subtropical waters, an area where cooler sea surface temperatures and a less favorable atmospheric structure typically limit how much a system can strengthen even if it does manage to organize. Forecasters expect this second system to encounter progressively cooler waters as it continues moving through the North Atlantic, a trajectory that tends to cap development well short of what a system tracking through the tropics might achieve. Even so, its presence alongside Invest 92L means forecasters are now watching 2 separate areas of the Atlantic simultaneously for the first time in weeks, itself a notable shift after such an extended stretch of basin-wide quiet. It's worth explaining exactly why storms that emerge from this specific stretch of ocean, the tropical waves rolling off the African coast near the Cape Verde Islands, get so much more attention from meteorologists than disturbances forming closer to the United States, because the answer explains a great deal about why this particular system matters, even while its ultimate track remains genuinely uncertain. Cape Verde-type systems form near the westernmost point of Africa, and then track thousands of miles across the entire width of the Atlantic Ocean before reaching the Caribbean or the United States, giving them an unusually long runway over warm, open water to organize, strengthen, and, in the right conditions, grow into some of the largest and most powerful hurricanes the basin ever produces. Because these systems spend so much time over open ocean before threatening any populated coastline, they also tend to be the storms most closely modeled and most heavily scrutinized by forecasters, precisely because a small shift in their track early in their life cycle can translate into an enormous difference in exactly where and how powerfully they eventually make landfall thousands of miles later. This is the same broad category of storm that has historically produced some of the most devastating hurricanes in Atlantic history, systems that spend a week or more crossing open water, encountering exactly the kind of warm sea surface temperatures and low wind shear that allow gradual sustained strengthening rather than the sharp, short-lived spikes typical of storms that form much closer to shore. The computer models currently being run on Invest 92L reflect exactly how much uncertainty still surrounds this system at such an early stage of its development, and that uncertainty is itself an important part of the story right now rather than something to wait out before paying attention. Some forecast guidance shows the system curving northward relatively early in its track, pulled by the same broad pattern of atmospheric steering currents that would carry it out into the open central Atlantic and away from any populated landmass entirely. A scenario that would allow the storm to strengthen over open water without posing a direct threat to the Caribbean, Bermuda, or the United States. Other models show a track running considerably further south and west, closer to the Caribbean islands, raising the kind of scenario that would require considerably more attention from residents across the eastern Caribbean, and potentially beyond, depending on how the storm's path evolves as it approaches land. This kind of wide model spread is completely normal for a system still 5 to 7 days out from any potential landfall, but it also means the true scope of who needs to prepare is not yet knowable with any real confidence. And it's exactly why meteorologists are urging residents across the Caribbean, Bermuda, and the broader southeastern United States to simply start paying attention now, rather than waiting for the picture to sharpen closer to any potential impact. There's a scientific dimension to explosive tropical development worth understanding here too, because it explains why forecasters watch the transition from disorganized wave to genuine tropical depression so closely, rather than treating it as a routine formality. A tropical wave, in its earliest stage, is essentially a loosely organized cluster of thunderstorms riding along a ripple in the atmosphere, with no defined center of rotation, and no closed circulation tying the whole system together. For that cluster to become a tropical depression, it needs several specific ingredients to align simultaneously. Warm ocean water extending down to a meaningful depth, rather than just sitting at the surface, low wind shear, so the storm's vertical structure isn't torn apart as it tries to build, sufficiently moist air surrounding the system so that dry air doesn't choke off the thunderstorm activity feeding it, and enough spin already present in the atmosphere for the loose cluster of storms to begin organizing around a genuine center. When all of those ingredients come together at once, the transition from disorganized wave to defined tropical depression can happen surprisingly quickly, sometimes within 24 hours, and once a system does develop a closed circulation, it becomes dramatically more efficient at drawing energy from the ocean beneath it, which is exactly the mechanism that allows a storm to strengthen from a weak tropical depression into a hurricane over a period of just a few days if conditions remain favorable along its track. Invest 92L's 70% formation probability reflects forecaster confidence that most of these ingredients are already falling into place, even though the storm has not yet crossed the threshold into an officially organized system as of this recording. It's also worth understanding how forecasters actually build the spread of possible tracks you see represented across different computer models, because that process explains why the guidance for Invest 92L still shows such a wide range of outcomes at this stage. Meteorologists run several different global and regional forecast models simultaneously, each one using a slightly different mathematical approach to simulate the atmosphere, different resolution, different ways of representing physical processes like cloud formation and heat exchange with the ocean, and different starting data drawn from satellites, weather balloons, and ocean buoys scattered across the basin. Early in a storm's life, when the system itself is still loosely organized and the atmosphere steering it is still several days away from actually arriving, these different models can diverge substantially from one another, sometimes by hundreds of miles in terms of projected track, and sometimes by a full category or more in terms of projected intensity. As a storm matures and actually develops a defined center, and as the forecast window shortens from a week out to just a few days out, these models typically begin converging on a tighter, more reliable range of outcomes, which is exactly why meteorologists consistently caution against fixating on any single model run this early, encouraging people instead to watch how the overall spread of guidance narrows over the coming several days, rather than reacting to whichever individual model happens to look most alarming or most reassuring on any given day. Hurricane Hunter aircraft, operated by the Air Force Reserve and NOAA, are also on standby to fly directly into systems like Invest 92L, once they organize enough to justify a reconnaissance mission, and the data those flights gather, actual measurements of central pressure, wind speed, and internal storm structure taken from inside the system itself, consistently proves far more valuable to forecasters than satellite estimates alone, often triggering meaningful adjustments to both track and intensity forecasts within hours of the first flight once a storm is deemed organized enough to warrant one. That single Hurricane Hunter data point can sometimes shift a forecast track by dozens of miles or adjust an intensity projection by a full category, which is exactly why meteorologists treat the first reconnaissance flight into a newly organizing system as one of the more consequential moments in a storm's early forecast history, often more influential to the final track guidance than an entire additional day of pure computer modeling. There's a specific meteorological phenomenon at play here worth understanding, because it's the same feature that ultimately determines whether a storm like this stays out at sea or turns toward land, and it's called the subtropical ridge, sometimes referred to as the Bermuda High. This is a large, semi-permanent zone of high pressure that typically sits over the central Atlantic during the summer months, and it functions essentially as a wall, steering storms along its southern and western edge, the way water flows around a boulder in a stream. When that ridge sits further north and stronger than usual, it tends to push developing storms westward toward the Caribbean and potentially the United States before any northward turn can happen. When the ridge weakens or shifts position, it can open up what forecasters often describe as an escape route, allowing a storm to curve northward and out to sea well before it ever reaches land. Exactly where that ridge sets up over the coming week and how it evolves as Invest 92L approaches the Caribbean will likely be the single biggest factor determining this storm's ultimate path, which is precisely why forecasters have been reluctant to commit to any single scenario this early, even with a system that already carries a 70% chance of formation. What makes this particular moment worth taking seriously, even with all of that genuine uncertainty still in play, comes down to timing as much as anything else happening in the atmosphere. The average date for the first hurricane of the Atlantic season to form is August 11th, essentially today, based on decades of historical record keeping. A season running significantly behind that average pace, the way 2026 has been running for weeks now, doesn't mean the atmosphere has simply decided to stay quiet for the rest of the year. It means the basin has been storing up potential energy. In a sense, warm water and instability that eventually finds a way to express itself once the specific combination of suppressing factors, the elevated wind shear, the sinking air, the slightly cooler sea surface temperatures, finally relaxes even briefly. When conditions do turn even modestly more favorable, as forecasters are now projecting will happen around Invest 92L over the next several days, a quiet season can transition from producing nothing to producing a rapidly strengthening system in a remarkably short window, precisely because so much of the ocean's underlying warmth has remained undisturbed by an unusually low number of storms churning through it so far this year. That's not a guarantee this particular system becomes something historic. It's simply the reason meteorologists watch a season's first real test of organization so closely after a stretch this quiet, rather than assuming a slow start means the rest of the season will simply follow the same subdued pattern. This is also the exact moment in a quiet season where the phrase every hurricane specialist repeats without fail becomes genuinely important to understand rather than dismiss as a rote disclaimer, the idea that it only takes one. That phrase exists because Atlantic hurricane history is full of examples where an overall below-average season, sometimes a dramatically below-average one, still produced a single storm capable of causing catastrophic historic damage. The clearest example remains 1992, a season that finished with well below the typical number of named storms for the year, yet still produced Hurricane Andrew, a storm that tore through South Florida as a Category 5 hurricane, flattened entire neighborhoods, and remains, adjusted for inflation, one of the costliest hurricanes in American history. Andrew formed relatively late in a quiet season out of a system that early forecast models genuinely struggled to agree on, not unlike the spread currently showing up across the guidance for Invest 92L. The lesson forecasters draw from storms like Andrew isn't that every quiet season inevitably produces a monster hurricane, most of them don't, but that seasonal averages describe the overall character of a season, not the specific danger posed by any individual storm that does manage to form within it. A below-average year filled mostly with weak, short-lived systems can still, in a single week, produce the one storm capable of reshaping an entire coastline, and there is no reliable way to know in advance which developing wave will turn out to be that storm until the atmosphere actually reveals its hand. That uncertainty is precisely why the practical guidance from meteorologists tracking Invest 92L right now focuses less on predicting a specific outcome and more on encouraging genuine, unhurried preparation while there's still time to act calmly rather than urgently. For residents across the Caribbean, that means reviewing hurricane preparedness plans that may have gone unused for years, given how quiet recent seasons have been in some of those island communities, confirming evacuation routes if you live in a coastal or flood-prone area, and paying close attention to updated forecast guidance as it's released roughly every 6 hours by the National Hurricane Center. For anyone along the southeastern United States coastline, from Florida up through the Carolinas, the guidance is similarly straightforward at this early stage. There is no immediate threat based on current forecasting, but a storm still 5 to 7 days from any potential landfall carries enough inherent uncertainty in its track that waiting until it's 96 hours out to think about preparedness leaves considerably less room to act if the models do eventually converge on a path bringing real impacts to land. Basic hurricane readiness, checking that emergency supplies are stocked, reviewing insurance coverage, knowing your evacuation zone if you live along a vulnerable coastline, costs nothing to do now and can save an enormous amount of stress later if this storm, or the one that follows it, does eventually turn toward a populated coastline. It's also worth being clear about what we genuinely don't know yet, because responsible tracking of a storm this early in its life cycle means resisting the urge to overpredict a system that hasn't even technically formed as a tropical depression at the time of this recording. Invest 92L could very plausibly follow the path several of this year's earlier, weaker disturbances have taken, organizing modestly, drifting northward into the open Atlantic, and dissipating without ever threatening land at all. That outcome remains entirely possible, and given how consistently unfavorable this season's broader atmospheric pattern has been for development, it may even be the more statistically likely, one based on how this year has unfolded so far. But the specific combination of a 70% formation probability, a track still genuinely split between models, and a subtropical ridge whose exact strength and position over the coming days remains one of the more difficult atmospheric features to forecast with precision this far out, together make this a system worth tracking closely, rather than dismissing simply because the overall season has been unusually calm up to this point. The same applies to a lesser degree to invest 93L near Bermuda, a system with lower odds of significant development, but one still worth monitoring, given its proximity to a populated island that, while accustomed to tropical systems passing nearby, still faces real risk from any storm that manages to organize before reaching cooler waters further north. For anyone specifically living across the Lesser Antilles or the broader Eastern Caribbean, there's an added layer of vigilance worth understanding beyond the general guidance already covered, because islands in that part of the basin face a genuinely different set of preparedness challenges than coastal residents on the American mainland. Many of these island nations have far less advanced warning time available, even once a storm's track becomes clearer, since the system tracking directly across the Atlantic from the Cape Verde region can reach the Lesser Antilles well before it reaches any part of the continental United States, sometimes compressing the useful preparation window down to just a few days once the storm's path genuinely solidifies. Island infrastructure, including power grids, water systems, and transportation networks connecting smaller islands to larger ones, can also take considerably longer to fully recover from a direct hit than similar infrastructure on the mainland, a reality painfully illustrated by several major hurricanes over the past decade that caused prolonged, months-long disruptions to power and water access across parts of the Caribbean long after the storm itself had moved on. That same recovery lag is part of why regional officials tend to activate emergency protocols earlier and more cautiously than mainland agencies facing a storm of comparable strength, treating the cost of an unnecessary precaution as far smaller than the cost of being caught unprepared on an island with limited ability to bring in outside help quickly. Regional meteorological agencies throughout the Caribbean, working alongside the National Hurricane Center's own forecasts, have been emphasizing exactly this point in their own public messaging over the past several days, encouraging residents not to wait for a storm to reach official hurricane strength before reviewing supply levels, securing loose outdoor items, and confirming family communication plans, given how little runway island communities sometimes have once a system's track finally becomes clear. Stepping back from the specifics of this individual system, there's a broader pattern worth understanding about how hurricane seasons actually unfold in practice, because it's easy to mistake a quiet start for a promise about how the rest of the season will go, when the historical record makes clear that the two are far less connected than that instinct suggests. Peak hurricane season, the stretch when the Atlantic basin typically produces the largest number of storms and the highest odds of a major hurricane forming, doesn't arrive until September 10th, still weeks away from where we currently stand. That means even in a season running as far behind its usual pace as 2026 has been, the bulk of the traditionally most dangerous stretch of the calendar remains entirely ahead rather than behind us. A quiet June, July, and early August have historically told forecasters relatively little about what September and October ultimately bring, and multiple past seasons, including some of the most destructive on record, followed remarkably slow starts before erupting into activity once the atmosphere's suppressing factors finally relaxed. Exactly the kind of transition meteorologists are now watching for as Invest 92L attempts to become the season's breakthrough system. There's also a longer historical thread worth pulling on here, because the relationship between El Niño and Atlantic hurricane activity has been studied extensively enough that meteorologists can point to specific past seasons as reasonably close analogs for what 2026 has been experiencing. Strong El Niño years have repeatedly correlated with suppressed Atlantic hurricane activity going back through the modern satellite record, including the 1997 season already mentioned, as well as 2015, another year when a robust El Niño pattern kept overall Atlantic activity well below the long-term average, even as the eastern and central Pacific basins, which respond to El Niño in the opposite direction, saw unusually intense hurricane activity of their own that same year. That inverse relationship between the Pacific and Atlantic basins during El Niño years is itself a well-documented pattern, Essentially, the same shift in global atmospheric circulation that increases wind shear over the Atlantic tends to reduce it over parts of the Pacific, redistributing where the planet's tropical cyclone energy actually concentrates in any given year, rather than simply reducing it everywhere at once. Forecasters watching this year's numbers have noted that overall accumulated cyclone energy across the entire northern hemisphere, a metric that adds up the combined strength and duration of every tropical system forming anywhere north of the equator, has been running significantly behind its seasonal average as well, reinforcing that this isn't simply an Atlantic-specific quirk, but part of a broader hemisphere-wide pattern tied directly to the strengthening El Niño sitting out in the tropical Pacific. What happens over the next several days with this storm will tell us a great deal about whether this Atlantic season continues along its historically unusual, dramatically suppressed path, or whether, like 2022 before it, an eerily quiet stretch gives way to a far more active back half of the season once the atmospheric conditions holding development in check finally ease. Either outcome remains genuinely possible based on everything forecasters currently know, and that honest uncertainty, rather than any specific alarming prediction, is exactly why this particular system deserves your attention right now. A storm forming out of one of the quietest Atlantic stretches in recent memory, arriving almost exactly on the calendar date, history tells us to expect the season's first hurricane, tracking through the exact stretch of ocean that has produced some of the most consequential hurricanes in American history, with computer models still genuinely divided on whether it curves harmlessly out to sea or pushes toward populated land, is precisely the kind of moment worth watching closely rather than assuming will resolve itself quietly the way so much of this season already has. We'll be tracking Invest 92L, Invest 93L, and whatever they eventually become over the coming days as new model runs, and forecast updates come in. So make sure you're subscribed to catch every development as this story unfolds. If this helped you understand what's actually happening in the Atlantic right now, share it with anyone you know along the Gulf Coast, the Southeast, or the Caribbean who should be paying attention. Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.